Now onto the well-known for loops. Just like if-else statements, these are essential for any programmer and they're used all the time. Essentially they're used for executing a block of code a certain number of times, each time using different values. So we'll get stuck in and get straight into it because as you can see here, this might be a bit confusing to you at first, but it will very quickly make sense. So let's get stuck in. We're going to start with our JavaScript here and we're just going to go straight into having a for loop. So essentially, first thing we do is we write for. And then this creates a lot of stuff for us. We don't actually need to use all of it like this, so we're going to do it from scratch. So the first thing we're going to start off with is creating a variable. You can think of it being 3 little chunks of code that we have in this bracket that are used for different things. The first thing we're doing is we're creating a variable. And this variable is created before anything else happens in the for loop. So we're just going to create a variable. People tend to use the letter I. I don't know why. It's just kind of bog standard. So people can set, for example, we'll set it to I to 0. And you can do var I equals 0, but you don't actually need to. We can just do I equals 0. So that's the first thing that this block of code will do. It will create a variable called I, and it will give it the value of 0. We could give it whatever value we wanted, but having it at 0 tends to be pretty standard, and it kind of makes sense, and you'll see why in a bit. So the next thing that we do is we have a condition, and we say for as long as I is less than 10, execute this block of code. And that doesn't make sense right now until you do the next thing, which is you do I++. So essentially what this is doing, and this is really important, it's saying once you've executed the code in the for loop, so whatever we have in here, I want you to add 1 to I. You might remember from one of the previous lectures, doing ++ basically means add 1 to whatever the variable is. So essentially what we're doing, we're starting off with a variable of 0, and then we're executing the code. We're getting I equals 0, and it's saying, okay, yeah, I is less than 10 because it's 0, so execute the code, and at the end of this code, add 1 to this I. So I will now become 1. So just to show what's going on here, let's create an alert. And we want to say I is colon space, and then we're going to add I to the end. So I'm just going to run this and show you what I'm doing. Basically, I'm making sure each time the for loop goes that I is being outputted. So if I refresh this, I is 0. Then when I click OK, immediately another alert's going to appear. So what's happened here is essentially it's created this variable of 0, I equals 0, and it's passed the condition, yep, it's less than 10, and then it executed this block of code. So it said alert, I is 0, and that's what it did. And then as soon as it had done that, it added +1 to I, so I is now 1, and it goes to that again. So you're going to see that this is alerts are going to keep appearing until we get I is 9. When we get to I is 9, it's going to stop, because at this point I is 9, and then the code is going to add 1 to it, so I is going to be 10. And because I is no longer less than 10, it's just going to stop running. So now it's just finished. So that's for loops specifically. What you can also use it for, which is quite helpful, is you can use it to iterate through arrays. So let me show you what I mean. Let's create ourselves an array first. Let's go for array of fruit. And then in square brackets, that's how we make an array. We're just going to put in some different fruits. So banana, apple, orange, and let's go for raspberry. And just to make note of it, we've just been over this and it's kind of confusing the first time you hear about it. Let me just assure you that the first time I came across for loops, I found it quite confusing, but essentially you use it so often in programming that it quickly becomes second nature. So don't worry if you're not completely understanding it now. What you'll start to understand it as soon as you start to use it more and more yourself. And the more you get used to it, it will make complete sense as to how to use it. So basically I've created an array here, and now what I can do is I can use a for loop to actually just iterate through all of these. So if I were to, for example, you might remember about indexes. So I could do something like this. And let's comment this out for a second so that this is no longer being used in the code. Okay, so that's commented out. Let's do an alert here of the first array. So in order to get the first index, so banana, in order to do that, all I have to do is square brackets 0. You might remember that from a previous lecture. If not, you've just been reminded, so no worries. Essentially, this gets 0 is the first index. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we refresh, this page says banana. Great. So if I wanted to have raspberry, I'd go for 3. But what if I wanted raspberry to be spelled correctly? Then I'll do this. But also, what if you wanted to iterate through these arrays? So you wanted an alert for each of these different ones. Well, then you could use a for loop. So what you do, let's just move that down a little bit. I'm going to do for, and then in brackets, I'm going to create my variable I equals 0. So that could, for example, be the 0 index here. So maybe you're starting to understand what I'm going to do here. And we do I is less than. We could do 4, but let's say, for example, we don't know how long the list is. Then what we can do is use rFruit.length, which we've used before, and that will return just the length of the whole thing, which is 4. So as long as I is less than 4, which is what we want, right? 0, 1, 2, 3. Then we add 1 each time. And don't worry if you're not understanding this yet. Stay with me. I want to alert array fruit, and then in here, I'm just going to put I. So let's talk about what we've just done here. Essentially, we've created a variable called I, which is equivalent to 0. I is less than the length of this array, which is 4, so it's going to execute this code, which is going to be rFruit and then the index of 0, because I is equal to 0. So that's going to alert on banana. And then it's going to add 1. So I is then going to be 1. 1 is still less than 4, so it's going to execute. And this time it's going to be rFruit with the index of 1, which is apple, etc., etc. So let's run it and just make sure that it works. Banana, then it should be orange, apple, and then raspberry spelled correctly. Fantastic. So that's really the basics of for loops. It's both simple and complex at the same time. It's simple in that as soon as you understand what you're doing, it becomes second nature on when to use it, how to use it, and all that kind of stuff. But the syntax does look quite confusing at the start. So just like most of the things I advise with JavaScript, it's that you have a go at it yourself and you get used to the syntax until it becomes second nature. So essentially what you're doing is with a for loop, and in the brackets, you create a variable, separate it with a semicolon, then you give the condition. So I is less than a certain number usually. And then you separate with another semicolon on what you do with I, whether you add 1 or you could also minus 1. That could work as well. Obviously not in this context, but you can use it just like that as well. So as I say, what I recommend you do is have a go yourself. Just do something very simple like we did at the top here, where you just alert the number and just see how it works using this syntax. So have a go yourself, and then I'll see you in the next lecture.